research interest in solid state physics with emphasis on magnetic structure correlations in bulk ceramics and thin films. He has published more than 250 articles in national and international peer-reviewed journals and has also authored several books. So all of us welcome today Dr. Ramjanay Chaudhary for his talk. Now over to Dr. Ramjanay ji.
Fine, ma'am. Thank you. Good morning, and everyone. Wish that all of you are fit and fine and healthy in this odd situation. Before I start my presentation, I must express my thanks to Dr. Seema Sharma for giving me this opportunity to interact with all of you, and also coordinator Dr. Arun for allowing me to be present here and discussing some of our own feelings as far as research is concerned. As it is already explained that I work on mostly magnetic oxides materials. So I have picked up my topic in a way that to start with, it will give you that what are the challenges that we generally encounter when growing the thin films of various magnetic oxides. And of course, we all know that these magnetic oxides are used for different applications, particularly for spintronics and things of that nature. So I will gradually discuss about the challenges when we encounter while growing these films of different materials having different properties. And we will realize that one technique is not sufficient to grow all these materials together. So that is why we may have to have a consortium for thin film techniques, so that different techniques are available to grow materials of different choices. And why we need materials of different choices? Because we know that we need different applications. There can be applications in sensors, there can be applications in actuators, gas sensors, magnetic sensors, spintronic applications, anti-reflexing coating. So there are various applications of thin films, and for all these different applications, there are different materials available. And to grow all these different materials, we will require different techniques. So one technique is not sufficient. So that is why I have picked up the title of my talk, mostly related to thin films growth of novel oxide materials for spintronic applications. So before I continue, I will briefly talk about our own consortium, because again, this is consistent with the theme of this whole program. That is to make you aware about the different avenues, different possibilities, and different facilities available to you. And that actually doesn't cost anything. So I belong to UGC DI Consortium for Scientific Research, and our mandate is to promote or encourage or support the research using mega facilities which are created by Department of Atomic Energies to different universities or research institutes across the country. So you may know that Department of Atomic Energy has created 4 mega facilities in the country, particularly as listed here. One is neutron beam at Dhruva reactor, then Indus synchrotron at RRCAT, cyclotron source at VECC Kolkata, and low energy accelerator at IGCAR Kalpakkam. And accordingly, our institute is actually located at 4 different places in the country. Indore is the main center. Then we have another center in Mumbai, another center in Kolkata, and a nodal center in Kalpakkam. And you can visit our webpage, which is csr.res.in, and there you will see that what are the facilities which are available for different measurements. And you may note that you will not require even a single penny to use these facilities. Your logistics like travel or local accommodation, etc., will be taken care by us. What you have to do is to come out with a well-prepared plan where what kind of experiments you may need. And accordingly, you will see that we have, besides these Department of Atomic Energy facilities, we have several in-house facilities also available, and which are listed here. Like for magnetization measurements, we have a wide range of techniques like SQUID, VSM, magnetoker effect, AC susceptibility, in situ Moog effect. For growing thin films, again, we have a wide range of techniques available with us. For spectroscopic techniques, photoelectron spectroscopy, secondary ion mass spectroscopy, ESCA, Mossbauer spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, wide range of techniques are there. So what you have to do is to come out with a prepared plan. Similarly, for microscopic techniques, we have SEM, TEM, EDAX. SEM is equipped with EDAX, confocal microscopy, scanning probe microscopy. For transport or thermal measurements, we have, right from 300 millikelvin to room temperature, or even beyond room temperature, high magnetic field for doing these measurements, P-loop tracer, dielectric relaxation spectroscopy. So a wide range of techniques are available for growing, for probing, for measuring different physical properties, which can be magnetic, which can be optical, which can be structural, which can be surface morphology, which can be thermal property, which can be electrical transport property, which can be magnetotransport properties. So besides characterizing, we have several growth techniques also. Those growth techniques can be preparation of single crystal techniques, preparation of polycrystalline materials, preparation of thin films in amorphous or polycrystalline or oriented or epitaxial films. So please do not hesitate to contact us if you feel that if any of the facility is suitable to you for your research purpose. Now, coming to the theme or topic of my talk, okay, this is my group, and at present, these students are involved with us, and these students have finished their PhD. Okay, so plan of my talk is why, how, and parameters. Like, why do we need thin films? Number two, how we prepare those thin films? And number three, what are the parameters which generally control the properties of these thin films? You may realize that the thin films can have a different properties altogether with respect to their bulk compound, because bulk compound can have a different structure than your thin film. Your thin film can have dense, can be less dense as compared to your bulk. Your thin films can have a different defect structure as compared to your bulk, and all these defect structures control your properties. So that is why it is very important to know that what are those parameters which control these defect structures in thin films, how the properties completely can vary with respect to their bulk, and why does it happen. So before doing that, first of all, we will have to really appreciate why do we need thin films at all. And the simple answer is that if you look at why do we need, because we are changing ourselves. We are changing from Harappa civilization to the modern world. We are changing from our 1947 independence era to the modern era of 2021, where everything had changed so rapidly, right from our aerodynamics to petroleum industry to computer industry, or our own James Bond, who, we know that right from Sean Connery days to our modern Daniel Craig day, his car is actually changing. And why all this is happening is because of the rapid enhancement in the technological area as far as the thin film growth is concerned. So what thin film has allowed us is to miniaturize any materials in a very tiny shape and size, and that allows you to control or to arrange different materials together on a single platform, and all these different materials can have different properties. One of them can be for data storage, another can be for moisture sensor, another can be for gas sensors, or for thermoelectric, or for PN junction, or for photovoltaic, or for magnetic sensors. So all these different materials which are arranged on a single platform having different applications, then what it allows it to, if you use that particular device with different features associated with it, then it is like a multifunctionality. It gives you if you keep it in some kind of atmosphere, it will sense that what is the nature of gas, what is the level of moisture, things of that nature. So it will store those informations, and those informations can be transmitted to the brain, the so-called the powerhouse, which actually decides where several logistics are available. Those logistics comprise of your PN junction diodes or integrated circuits. So using those integrated circuits or diodes or different electronic structure, it actually decides that in this given situation, what kind of action has to be taken. So suppose if there is some hazardous gas coming out, then that brain or the powerhouse actually decides, okay, this is the gas which is coming out. So an alarm has to be put on. So it transfers that information to the alarm section, and then the alarm is on. And then what we see is that we have a complete package of the device where a combination of sensors, actuators, decision makers, all of them are simultaneously available. And all this advancement has taken place because thin films have grown up to that stage that it allows us to visualize or conceptualize several systems and integrate them together on a single platform, which can act like a multi-talented materials which will have different features to act, to sense, and to actually make a decision. So thin films has a very, very wide applications. And you may note that all these different properties, all these different applications which these thin films generally show, they cannot be obtained from a single material, because all these single materials can have different applications. So for different applications, like for temperature sensors, or in other words, bolometric sensors, we generally talk about the manganites, vanadium oxides, or yttrium, barium, cuprate oxides. For solar cells, again, cadmium telluride or silicon or transparent conducting oxides. For moisture sensors, we have aluminum oxide or P2O5. For gas sensors, we have SNO2, TiO2, zinc oxide. So different applications, that means we require different materials, right? So there are different materials which are available with us, and using these different materials, we can actually integrate all these materials together on a single platform with different applications. And with those integrations, we can come out with altogether different properties. So please note that these thin films are somewhat different from their bulk counterparts because they are not fully dense as compared to their bulk. They are under stress. Remember, when I say that they are under stress, stress means there is a change in its unit cell lattice parameters. And that change in unit cell lattice parameter can arise because you are integrating that thin film on a given substrate, on a given platform, and that substrate will have its own unit cell. So that own unit cell will not allow that incoming thin film to adopt its original unit cell lattice parameter. So what it does, it forces that particular evaporants, when it is rearranging itself on the substrate, to adopt the substrate's unit cell lattice parameter. It is like you are visiting your friend's house, then you do not follow the culture of your own house. Rather, you try to follow the culture of your friend's house. So you behave more properly or in a more disciplined way as compared to your inherent natural way of living, right? So that is nothing but the adaptation of yourself on a foreign substrate, on a different platform, right? So similarly, these thin films or these evaporants, when they rearrange on a substrate, they try to align, they try to rearrange itself on a given substrate and try to adopt its unit cell lattice parameter. And because of that, it changes its original lattice parameter. Of course, not always. I will talk about all those things in detail as we come across. But I'm just giving you an example that in what situation a stress can arise. So because of that adaptation of the unit cell as compared to its substrate, your lattice parameter of the film slightly changes, right? So that slight change in the lattice parameter gives rise to huge change in the electrical, optical, magnetic, structural properties. So it is very important to characterize what kind of stress is present in my system. Then we have different defect structure with respect to bulb. So again, defect is also a very crucial parameter which actually control many of the properties. For instance, if you just look at titanium oxide or tin oxide, you will see that people generally talk very nicely that, okay, titanium oxide is a very good transparent conducting oxide. Tin oxide is a very good transparent conducting oxide. Similarly, zinc oxide. But how come it can be transparent and conducting together? Remember, all these materials have a band gap of, say, more than 3 electron volt. Titanium oxide is like 3.4 electron volt. Zinc oxide is 3.6 electron volt. Similarly, tin oxide. So with that high band gap, you expect your material to be transparent. But how come it can be conducting? To have a conducting material, what you need is that there should be a sufficient free carriers in your conduction band. Your Fermi level should be in your conduction band, right? So if you look at the metallic system, why metals are metallic? Because there is no gap between the valence band and the conduction band. Your Fermi level is right into the conduction. Okay, so you have sufficient number of free electrons in the case of metallic systems. But with those materials which are having wide band gap of 3.4 electron volt or 3.2 electron volt, then with that gap, how do you expect that the electron from the valence band will be excited to the conduction band? To have that, you really need very high energy. That energy is not generally available. So how do you, or how can you use it for transparent and conducting oxides together? So there is the beauty that all these materials, they are inherently non-stoichiometric in nature. They do not like to be in the pure stoichiometric. When I say stoichiometry, that means I'm talking about the chemical elements ratio present in the composition. For instance, if I'm talking of SnO2, that means I'm talking of SN1 oxygen 2. This is 1:2 is the stoichiometry. So if there is deviation from the stoichiometry, suppose if I have a system like SnO 1.9, so that means there is some oxygen vacancy. So all these oxygen vacancies which act like a defect present in your system, these defect states create a kind of additional energy states in your band gap, right? And that additional energy state which forms a shallow donor level just below your conduction band, they actually give rise to the free carriers. And that is why your system starts behaving like a conducting oxides. So these are the advantages of controlling the defect structure in thin films, because it allows you to tune the resistivity or the conductivity of the given material, right? So that is very interesting as far as the thin films are concerned. Similarly, these thin films are like quasi two-dimensional. They are very thin films, and they are strongly influenced by the surface and the interface effects. Interface effect, I have already discussed that since you are integrating with respect to substrate, then substrate tries to invoke its own force on the unit cell of the evaporants of the thin film. So that is why interface actually controls many of the properties. Besides that, your surface is also very important in thin films, because suppose your film thickness is say 1 nanometer, then in your material mostly your system is either only interface or only the surface. There is not much left as far as the bulk is concerned. So we know that at surface, many of the coordinates actually change considerably. The surface energy is entirely different with respect to bulk. So therefore, enhanced contribution of the surface energy give rise to various changes in the electrical, magnetic, optical, thermal, or mechanical properties. So this is very important aspect as far as the thin films are concerned. So what it does, it allows us to manipulate the properties of a given material in a way that we may like for a certain application. So that is very important as far as the thin films are concerned. Now, what are the techniques to grow thin films? One is the physical vapor deposition and another is the chemical vapor deposition. The name tells you, in physical vapor deposition, we are using physical method to vaporize the material to get the deposition done. Whereas in chemical vapor deposition, it's the chemical method which is actually reacting at the substrate surface between different chemical precursors, and that allows that deposition to take place. So in a physical vapor deposition, we are using physical method to vaporize the material. Now we can ask ourselves, what are those physical methods to vaporize the material? The easiest answer to that comes to our mind is that you simply evaporate it, you heat it. By heating, we can get the evaporation done. So if you have iron, if you have any tungsten, you just heat it, so that when that heat energy overcomes the bond energy between the different atoms, then those atoms starts evaporating. And then you collect those evaporants on a given substrate. That is how you get the deposition done in physical method. So the question arises, is heating the only method to get the evaporation done? To understand that, let's try to understand what heating actually does. While we are giving a thermal heating, that heating is nothing but you are giving thermal energy to the material. And where is that thermal energy expended? That is used in overcoming the bond energy. So that means there is a transfer of thermal energy to the target material to overcome the bond energy. Now, is that the only way? The answer is no. You can bombard the energetic electron beams. So those energetic electron beams can interact with your target material and can transfer its energy to overcome the bond energy. That is another way. You can bombard the energetic ions on the target material to transfer its energy to overcome the bond energy. You can bombard the laser beam to interact with the target material to overcome the binding energy. So there are different ways of transferring the energy to the target material, and accordingly we have different techniques to grow these thin films. If we are using thermal heating, then we call that technique as thermal evaporation. If we are using electron beam bombardment to overcome the bond energy or to get the evaporation done, we call that technique as electron beam evaporation. If we are using energetic ions to bombard the target material, we call that technique as ion beam sputtering. Similarly, if we are using laser beam, we call that technique like pulse laser deposition, right? So these are some of the physical vapor deposition technique, and which is available at our consortium. This one is chemical vapor deposition, so I'm not going in detail about this. Let's focus on physical vapor deposition for the discussion of today. Okay, so these are different ways of getting deposition done. So initially my compound was in solid state, I vaporized it, that vapor was transported to the substrate, and then on the substrate they rearrange, and then they rearrange in the solid phase, and then we get the thin film deposition done. So this is a very important aspect, and we will have to understand that why do we need all these different techniques to grow different materials. Why not one technique is sufficient to grow different materials altogether? To understand that, let's look into their merits and demerits. Okay. Remember, in thermal evaporation or electron beam evaporation, the thermal energy or the electron beam energy is given to the target material. And then because of that energy exchange, it starts evaporating. So there is rate of free evaporation, and this rate of free evaporation simply follows our gas kinematics law. And if you simply simplify that gas kinematics law, which is Charles law and Boyle's law, then you will see that the rate of free evaporation actually depends on the mass of the or molecular mass of the elements present in your target material, right? So what does that mean? That's okay. If I have to grow a material like iron or copper or titanium or cobalt or silicon, all these different materials. All these different materials can be easily grown by this thermal evaporation or electron beam evaporation. But suppose if your compound is having some composition like zirconium titanate or barium titanate or lanthanum manganese oxide or BiFeO3 or yttrium barium cuprate. So that means you have more than one element present in its composition. And all these elements have different Z number and hence different molecular mass. So since they have different molecular mass, their rate of free evaporation will be different. So when they reach at the substrate, their actual composition is not exactly as it was earlier in its original bulk form. So in your thin film, your stoichiometry of the original bulk may not be retained, and hence you will lose its original property. You can come out with altogether a different material. So therefore, this particular technique is good to grow a metallic film, but not those materials which are like ceramics, which contain more than one elements in its composition. Okay, so this is one limitation. Another limitation for this particular material, particularly thermal beam evaporation, you could have simply said we can just heat. But remember, there are different elements whose melting temperature is way beyond the heating temperature, which can be used using these normal heaters, right? So even before your target material starts evaporating, your heating element itself will start evaporating. So if your heating element starts evaporating, then your heating element is different from your target material, and hence those heating elements will start giving rise to contamination in your thin film. So therefore, thermal beam evaporation cannot be used for those materials whose evaporation temperature or melting temperature is much higher. Okay. Coming to another limitation of electron beam evaporation, suppose your target material is insulator, then growing these materials with electron beam evaporation is not possible, because the moment electron beam interacts with your target, then since your insulating material is non-conducting, electron beam does not find a sufficient way of transferring its energy to the target material, and therefore those electron beams, they just reside on the surface of your target and form a space charge region, and hence it prohibits the deposition to take place. And that is why these techniques are generally not used for insulators. Then we have magnetron sputtering. Again, in magnetron sputtering, we have energetic ions bombarding on the target materials, and these energetic ions, how do they transfer their energy? This is what we generally studied in class 8 or class 9, if I remember correctly. It was the conservation of energy and conservation of moment. So the total incident energy should be equal to the total final energy. So this was your total incident energy. This was the mass which is impinging on your target material, and this is the mass with which your target material is actually ejecting out. Okay, so just by solving this particular equation, what you will get is that a sputtering yield, that means the number of elements which are coming out from the target material, they actually again depends on the atomic mass of the elements present in the compound. Okay, so again, this particular technique is good to grow thin films of wide range of materials. It can be used for even growing insulating materials like magnesium oxide, silicon oxide, aluminum oxide, titanium oxide, and things of that nature, which electron beam evaporation could not do, but thermal beam evaporation is sufficient to get us those films. But then again, there is limitation as far as the compound with many elements in its composition are concerned, like YbCO, yttrium barium cuprate oxide. So that is not possible, because if you have a palette with yttrium, barium, copper, then again yttrium, barium, copper, they have different mass, so they will sputter at different rate, and hence they reach at the substrate in different ratio, and hence the stoichiometry is actually not written. So that is one limitation again as far as magnetron sputtering is concerned. Another issue as far as magnetron sputtering is concerned is the pressure window in which it can work. This magnetron sputtering can work in a very narrow pressure window, and that is from say 5 to 10 millitorr to some 30-40 millitorr. So there are different materials which either require vacuum to grow or they require much higher oxygen partial pressure to grow. So those materials again cannot be grown using this magnetron sputtering technique. So these are some of the limitations, and we have so far discussed about thermal beam evaporation, electron beam evaporation, magnetron sputtering, RF sputtering, and things of that nature. Now, the question arises, what about those elements, what about those materials which contain more than one element in its composition, which are multi-talented, as I generally say? How to get their thin films done? And for them, we have a technique which is called as thin films deposition by pulsed laser deposition. How do we get that done? In pulsed laser deposition, we have a pulsed beam of laser interacting the target material. And remember that pulse duration is like 20 nanoseconds. And that laser beam, suppose, has an energy of say 200 millijoule. So that 200 millijoule laser energy is transported to the target material in 20 nanoseconds. And because of that, the power that it generates is given by energy per unit time, 200 millijoule divided by 20 nanosecond, that is like 10 megawatt. With that high power, whatever the dielectric bond is present in the target material, all of them are simultaneously broken. And because of that, the moment laser beam interacts the target material, all the elements, all the composition, whatever is present in its vicinity, they all are simultaneously ejected. And that is how it preserves the stoichiometry of those compounds which contain more than one element in its composition. So this is a very, very important aspect to grow those materials to preserve its stoichiometry. So this is as far as pulse laser deposition is concerned. Now we have discussed about the techniques which are available to grow thin films. So what these techniques do, they just eject or evaporate or sputter or ablate the elements from their target, and they are ejected from the compound. Now they are transported towards the substrate. Now the question arises, your actually film formation is taking place at the substrate. What is happening there? Let's try to understand. Okay, excuse me. So these evaporants, when they reach at the substrate, they first try to get a thermal equilibrium. They are adsorbed on the substrate surface. Then they, after adsorbing on the substrate surface, they diffuse on the substrate surface from one side to another side, unless and until they find the second evaporant, third evaporant, fourth evaporant, and then there is a nucleation taking place. And after that nucleation, there is a growth at around those nucleation sites, and then finally some features start developing, which can be amorphous or polycrystalline or single crystalline. And then these different sites coalesce together to form a continuous film. So these are the steps of deposition. I mean, I will just give you a brief example of how to really appreciate this. Just imagine the first day of your college, when you joined your college, what you could have done, you could have first looked at the different facilities which are available in that college. Where is the classroom, who is the principal, what is the timetable, where is the library, and things of that nature. Okay, so you attained a thermal equilibrium. After attaining a thermal equilibrium, after you get accustomed with the surroundings, you start moving from one side to another side to see whether you are all alone in the college or some other fellow has also joined that particular course. And when you find your partner in your class, that okay, he is my friend who has also opted for the same course, then both of you start moving together unless and until you find the third person, then fourth person, then fifth person, and that is how you form your own group. Similarly, some other individual is forming his or her own group, and as those group sizes are growing, then there are some common students who act common between those two individual groups, and they form a larger group, and that is how this entire classroom is generally formed. Okay, similarly, these evaporants, when they reach at the substrate surface, they first try to attain a thermal equilibrium. They get adsorbed on the substrate surface. After attaining a thermal equilibrium, they hop onto the substrate surface from one side to another side, unless and until they find the second, then third, then fourth, then fifth, and that is how this nucleation actually takes place. And when this nucleation takes place, only then some structure is actually formed. Now, here is a point of caution that we all have to appreciate. How long can I move on the substrate surface to find my partner? Is there any timeline? Yes, there is a timeline. If within that timeline, if I do not find my partner, then I can simply get dissolved back into the atmosphere. I will not stay there for the longer time. This is a very important thing, right? So that means there has to be a proper surface diffusion to take place, so that the evaporant finds its partner to start the nucleation. Number one. Number two, can any nucleation be stable and it can give rise to a thin film growth? The answer is again no. Not all the nucleation is going to be stable. Any nucleation to be stable, there has to be a finite size of that nucleation. If that finite size is not available, then this nucleation may be unstable, and then again they will break into the pieces, and those evaporants can again get dissolved back into the atmosphere. So we'll just try to understand that what are those conditions under which those nucleation can be stable. Please remember, whenever that nucleation is taking place, nucleation means what? Nucleation means you have different evaporants coming together and they are forming some kind of size and shape. And when that shape actually takes place, that means it has certain surface, that means it has certain volume. So either to create a surface or to create a volume, we need to have sufficient energy available. Right? So we know that the surface energy is given by this 4 pi r square times gamma, which is nothing but surface energy per unit area. Whereas volume energy is given by 4/3 pi r cube delta GV. Delta GV is nothing but the change in free energy per unit volume. And it so happens that delta GV is negative because it tries to bind the things, whereas surface tension is a positive energy. Okay. So negative energy means bonding, positive energy means breaking, as simple as that, right? So to have a stable nucleation, we need to have a net energy negative. Okay. Now, when we have a competition of these two energy, which is the surface energy and the volume energy, you can see that the surface energy is positive, volume energy is negative. For a smaller radius, delta GS will be higher than delta GB. Of course, you can see that delta GS is only R square dependence, delta GB is R cube dependence. So how come delta GS is is larger than delta GB? The simplest answer is, if you just take the example of R equals 0.2, some arbitrary unit. So 0.2 square is 0.04, but 0.2 cube is 0.008, right? So that's why I'm saying that for a smaller radius, your delta GS is way beyond your delta GB. But if you take R equals 2, then R square is 4 and R cube is 8. So now delta GB has dominated. Okay. So for higher radius, it's delta GB which will dominate, whereas for a smaller radius, it's delta GS which will dominate. That means surface energy will dominate over the volume energy for a smaller radius of nucleation. So you can see that as long as your nucleation radius is below RC, it's delta GS, that means surface energy is dominating over the volume energy. And beyond RC, it's the total energy has started coming down, and beyond this point, your total energy becomes negative. Now just imagine a situation that you are depositing your films and you have stopped your deposition somewhere at a site which is below your RC. That means the critical nucleation dimension. So if you stop your deposition somewhere here, then we know that any movement of any process direction is governed by that in which direction its energy is lowered. So you can see here that for this point, the energy is lowered if it further lowers its radius. So what does that mean? That nucleation whose dimension is below RC, it will try to lower its energy by further shrinking itself, or by further breaking itself into smaller pieces. Okay, that is why I said that any nucleation will be stable only beyond it has crossed a critical radius, and that critical radius is given by this RC. How do we get that critical radius? The simplest thing is that to get the maxima, we have to have the total energy derivative with respect to radius equals 0. So this d delta G by dr should be equal to 0. And if you simply solve this equation, you will get the critical radius. And from there, you will get an idea that what nucleation dimension will be stable. Why is this important? That this is not only limited to thin film. It is also applicable to nanomaterials. You will see that nowadays people talk so many things about nanomaterials. I prepared 1 nanometer size or 2 nanometer size. First of all, we will have to really understand whether that 1 nanometer size nucleation is stable or not. In my opinion, that 1 nanometer dimension or below 1 nanometer dimension is not going to be stable, just because your surface energy is way beyond your volume energy, and the total energy becomes positive, and that will make the whole thing unstable. So this is a very important thing to really understand, that which nanoparticles are going to be stable. Okay. So if I increase the rate of deposition, or if I increase the temperature, then with increase in temperature, your energy barrier increases. Your energy barrier increases means what? You require a very high energy to make the nucleation stable. So that means you will have a smaller nucleation sites, but larger in dimension. So those will give rise to a kind of larger grain size picture, and larger grain size picture means your system will have a lesser contribution from your grain boundaries. If I generally compare with respect to single crystal, then single crystal is nothing but a single grain. Single grain means I will require only one nucleation site. If your substrate has many nucleation sites, then that means at all those nucleation sites, the growth is actually taking place. And all those growth actually is taking place possibly in different directions. And therefore, those films will give rise to polycrystalline films. So many nuclei means many grains, possibly polycrystalline films. That is something which we have to understand. Now, what are the issues of as far as the thin films are concerned? One is the stoichiometry. We have already discussed that in what condition the stoichiometry can be maintained. Another is the epitaxy. What is epitaxy? So since I have said that film is generally grown on a given substrate, and suppose if your substrate is single crystal in nature, and if the film also retains the similar crystalline arrangement as that of this substrate, we call that the film has grown epitaxially on this substrate. So that means if my substrate is single crystal, the film will also behave like a single crystal, right? So those films are epitaxial. Remember, epitaxy is not the property of the film. It's a relation between the substrate and the film. When the film retains a similar crystalline arrangement as that of the substrate, we call that the film is grown epitaxially on that substrate. Another issue is that of the impurity. What is impurity? When you are growing films at high temperature. Why do we need high temperature to grow films? Because as I said, that when your evaporants which are falling on your substrate, they first try to attain a thermal equilibrium. And after attaining the thermal equilibrium, it hops on the substrate surface from one side to another side. Now just imagine a situation that your substrate temperature is very, very low, and the evaporant which is coming on the substrate, when it arrives on the substrate, it looks at, okay, there is not sufficient energy available with the substrate surface. So it transfers all its energy in maintaining the thermal equilibrium with the substrate itself. And after that, it does not have sufficient energy available to hop or to move on the substrate surface from one side to another side. That means those evaporants which are falling on your substrate, they just stay there and there only. So that means in that particular situation, since no diffusion is taking place, your films are mostly amorphous in nature or nanocrystalline in nature. That is why to get a good crystalline film, we should have sufficient substrate temperature, but not very, very high substrate temperature, because if your substrate temperature is very high, then substrate atoms itself will start evaporating and they will interact with your film and will create an impurity. Okay, so these are some of the issues that we will have to really understand. Another thing is that how do we optimize the temperature? Remember, suppose if you have to grow a material, any material's phase is stable only in a particular pressure and temperature window. So if your temperature is way away from that window, suppose if I'm making something like BiFeO3, then the grown film can have bismuth oxide phase also, Fe2O3 phase also, FeO phase also, Fe3O4 phase also. And all these different phases are stable in different temperature and pressure window. So to get really a good BiFeO3 film, we will have to optimize the condition in terms of temperature and pressure to get the single phase film of all these materials. Okay, strain is another issue. As I said, that since the grown film tries to adopt the crystal structure as that of the substrate, then it can have a strain. Either your film unit cell can be slightly larger than that of the substrate unit cell, then in that case the substrate will pull force to match its lattice parameter, so that it will have in plane compressive force, compressive strain. If your substrate unit cell lattice parameter is smaller than that of the substrate, then substrate tries to stretch it to match its lattice parameter, then in that case your film will feel in plane tensile strain, right? So these are some of the issues. Then secondary phase is also one important issue I just discussed in terms of BiFeO3. Suppose if I have to prepare a film of BiFeO3, then of course I do not want that in that film there should be contribution of bismuth oxide or Fe2O3 or Fe or any other phase. Okay. So what are the parameters which control these thin films? One is the background gas and pressure, the substrate that we have chosen, and the lattice mismatch. As I said, that it tries to fit, then the lattice mismatch is given by substrate lattice parameter subtracted by film materials lattice parameter, divide by 100 into substrate lattice parameter. So I just said that if your film unit cell is smaller than that of the substrate, then in plane tensile strain is there. If it is larger, then in plane compressive strain is there. And how do we calculate a strain? A strain is nothing but the fractional change in the lattice parameter of the film with respect to bulk. That is your strain, as simple as that. Now, how do we choose substrate? Suppose if I have to make an epitaxial film, epitaxial films, when the film retains similar crystalline arrangement as that of the substrate. So suppose if I have to make a film of say LaMNO3 5.53, then the easiest substrate that I can think of is NdGaO3, right? Now the question arises, can I use this LaLO3? The answer is yes. If you look at this LaLO3, make a square, then the diagonal will be close to 5.4. So that means the lattice parameter matches very close to that of the film lattice parameter, and therefore that kind of substrate can also be used. Suppose if I have to grow an attached phase of TiO2 with lattice parameter 3.784, which substrate I should choose? The answer is, if you look at this 3.784, it matches very close to lanthanum aluminate. So I will pick up this particular substrate. Okay. So these are some of the tricks that people generally follow. Again, for YBCO, I will pick up either strontium titanate or LaLO3. Right. Now, just let me put it this way. My Fe3O4, if you look at Fe3O4, Fe3O4 has a lattice parameter 8.4 angstrom, close to 8.4 angstrom. And that 8.4 is exactly double of MgO, which is 4.2. So that means double of unit cell matches with 1 unit cell of Fe3O4. So that means if I grow a film of Fe3O4 on MgO, then double of MgO matches with 1 unit cell of Fe3O4, and that is how Fe3O4 can be grown epitaxially on MgO. And you can see here from this example that how do we check this? We do X-ray diffraction, and there you can see that Fe3O4 peak matches completely with that of MgO, and hence Fe3O4 002 reflection matches with MgO 004 reflection. Why is that? Because double of Fe3O4 matches with double of MgO matches with 1 unit cell of Fe3O4. And how do I confirm that this is epitaxial? To confirm that epitaxy nature, we should do in plane phi scan measurement, where you rotate your film in the in plane direction by 360 degree and record some other Bragg reflection, and you just probe that how many times that Bragg reflection is satisfied in that in plane 360 degree rotation. So you can see that it is satisfying 4 times separated by 90 degrees. So that means my film is having 4-fold symmetry. That means it is a spinal cubic in nature. And since these peaks match with that of MgO substrate, so that means the film retains the similar crystalline arrangement as that of the substrate. That is why I call these films as epitaxially grown on MgO substrate. Now, this was all about MgO substrate. So if I picked up the MgO with orientation C-axis oriented, the film was also growing C-axis oriented, and also it was epitaxial in nature. Now, what happens when I pick up some other substrate like say gallium arsenide or silicon or Al2O3? If you look at this particular substrate, these results, what do you see? That at all these substrates, the film is growing along 1-1-1 direction. So you, in your normal X-ray diffraction peaks, we get only 1-1-1, 2-2-2, 3-3-3, those reflections. We do not get 0-0-1 kind of reflection, which was available in MgO. Why does it happen? And surprisingly, even on glass, you can see that only 1-1-1 peak is. Glass is an amorphous substrate. What does that mean? What information do we get from here? Remember, when we picked up this MgO substrate, then on MgO, the lattice parameter of 2 MgO matched with 1 unit cell of Fe3O4. But in these substrates, there is a huge lattice mismatch between your film and the substrate. Therefore, in this particular case, the substrate direction does not control the film growth direction. Rather, it's the surface energy of the film material in which it has got its maximum number of dangling bonds, which has minimum surface energy, that will control the growth direction of the film. And for Fe3O4, it happens to be along 1-1-1 direction. So that is something which we have to understand, that when we have a huge mismatch, then it's the surface energy minimization which controls the film growth direction on a given substrate. For Fe3O4, this is 1-1-1. For zinc oxide, it can be 0-0-1. For tin oxide, it can be 1-1-0. Different materials, depending on their structure, have different directions in which it can minimize its surface energy. So this is one very important information that we have to understand. Okay. Now, what is the role of substrate temperature? Fe3O4 is a very funny material. You can see Fe3O4 is composed of FeO plus Fe2O3. So that means you can have FeO phase also, you can have Fe2O3 phase also, you can have Fe3O4 phase also. How do we really check that? So if you see that if when your substrate temperature was lower, say 350 degrees centigrade, we get besides these 111 peak, some additional peaks are also coming up. And those additional peaks are FeO phase. Okay, so that means that these film had some impurity phase or some secondary phase different from Fe3O4, different from the required. The moment the substrate temperature was increased to 450 degrees centigrade, it was entirely the oriented, the textured film that we got. Okay, so that is something which we have to really understand, that the substrate temperature is a very crucial role in determining the phase of the grown film. Number 3, when we record its X-ray diffraction, always plot the X-ray diffraction on the log scale, because on the log scale, any small impurity presence can be easily probed. Otherwise, you will just miss it. Because suppose your impurity phase is very less in intensity, let us assume 100. And if your film peak is say around 1 lakhs, main film peak. So as compared to 1 lakhs, if you plot that on linear scale, as compared to 1 lakh, 100 cannot be noticed easily. Right? But the moment you put them on log scale, this 1 lakh will come down to 5 and 100 becomes 2. So 2 can be easily probed in contrast to 5. So that is why it is very important to plot the thin film's X-ray diffraction on the log scale. Okay, the role of oxygen partial pressure. Oxygen partial pressure is a very important parameter. For instance, it is shown here for YBCU. You can see that this is grown on substrate like strontium titanate. Beautiful film, 002, 3, 4, 5, 6. No other film peak is observed. Why? Because this is epitaxially grown. You have an oriented film. So you will not be able to see any other HKL. That doesn't mean that in your film, you do not have a peaks like 110 or 113, that kind of peak. They are also there, but to probe those peaks, you will have to really realign your film so that your X-ray diffraction looks at that particular plane also. Okay, but this is at particular optimized oxygen partial pressure, which is 400 millitorr. But if you deposit these films in say 10 millitorr, then it loses all its superconducting property. Look at this YBCU, which was optimally grown at 90 Kelvin. There is a sharp drop in resistivity at 90 Kelvin. But when you grow its film in say 10 millitorr of oxygen partial pressure, it loses all its superconducting property, and its properties are gone. Now, this was all about the techniques to grow thin films. Now, I will just quickly talk about the spintronics. Do its Sandhi Vichhed, it will tell you spin-based electronics. So we will have these spintronic devices. It creates spin polarized currents and use the spin to control the current flow in a given device. And these are some of the examples where you can see that we have this giant magnetoresistance materials. You can see that in this giant magnetoresistance type of a structure, we have these iron layers which are actually separated by copper layer. We know that iron is magnetic in nature. So when their magnetization direction are opposite to each other and they are separated with respect to this spacer layer, which is copper, then when their orientations are different, then they have high resistance in zero magnetic field. But if you apply magnetic field so that this particular magnetic moment direction changes its direction parallel to the upper layer, then in that particular case, you will have a high field, zero resistance. Okay, so this type of material is called as giant magnetoresistance materials. Just by controlling the spin orientation, you are controlling their spin state. So that means there is a coupling between the magnetic property as well as the resistivity property of the system. Similarly, we have giant magnetoresistance materials where in place of this conducting layer, we have insulating layer, but still the electrons tunnel through this insulating layer. Therefore, its name is magnetic tunnel junction. So these examples actually illustrate the dependence of resistivity in terms of on their spin arrangement of that particular material. This is another example that you can see that we had this particular magnetic material and we integrated on a semiconducting substrate like niobium doped strontium titanate. And if you look at its IV characteristic, it shows non-linear IV. That means it has a rectifying behavior. But the moment you apply a magnetic field, say 8 Tesla, this resistivity completely changes, right, at room temperature. So that means just by applying field, you are changing its resistivity property. This allows us to control the resistivity property by applying a magnetic field, or one can control the magnetic property by applying electric field. So that kind of devices are spintronics material, and these spintronics materials are highly used. This allows you to decrease electric power consumption. You can increase the data processing speed, non-volatile in nature, increased integration densities compared with the conventional semiconducting based devices, and overall it combines your logics, which is nothing but the semiconducting properties, storage, which is nothing but your magnetic properties, sensors, which is nothing but the way those transport behavior actually takes place. So this is a combination of all these different properties together on in a given material. Okay, so these are some of the advantages of spintronic materials, but there are some questions. How do I combine the ferromagnetic materials with the semiconducting materials in the integrated circuits? Can we make those ferromagnetic semiconductors which are available, which are feasible at room temperature? Number 3, in what way we can efficiently inject the spin polarized current into the semiconductor? And even if we are able to inject that spin polarized current, how long that spin polarized current can be retained in that semiconducting matrix, and what happens at the interfaces between the different semiconductors? So these are some of the questions that people are generally looking for, and to answer these aspects, people came out with the idea of making altogether a different material, rather having a combination of ferromagnetic metal and semiconducting heterostructure, to rather create a material which is ferromagnetic as well as semiconducting together. And to achieve that, people started doing doping of ferromagnetic metals in an otherwise non-magnetic semiconducting host matrix, which is nothing but dilute magnetic semiconductors. In dilute magnetic semiconductors, you dope magnetic impurity in a semiconducting host matrix with an intention that these magnetic impurities which we are doping in the system, they do not form a cluster of their own. So the magnetic information is not coming from the magnetic clusters only, rather that magnetic information is coming from the spin polarized carriers in the system. That is a very important aspect. Okay, so it's not only the electron charge but also the electron spin which carries the information, and these magnetic moments should interact with each other via charge carrier. Okay, so this is a very important thing. So I do not want that magnetic impurity should form a cluster, rather they should be uniformly distributed in the system. And with that idea in mind, we started doping iron in titanium oxide. We know that titanium oxide is semiconductor and non-magnetic in nature, but with iron doping, can we induce magnetization and can have an spin polarized carrier? So we prepared its thin film by having undoped TiO2, then 2% iron doped TiO2, or 4% by varying iron concentration in this system. And you can see that the system was single phase in nature and it had an epitaxial behavior, as can be seen here. So this iron doped TiO2 was single phase in nature. Then how do I confirm that iron is substituted and is not forming a cluster of its own? Remember, if iron was in cluster phase, then the kind of bonding between iron and iron could have been a metallic bonding. But if you probe its ionic state by probing photoelectron spectroscopy, what it tells you that iron is not present in the metallic state, rather it is in ionic state. Okay, so that means iron is not forming a cluster of its own. So that is one thing which is very important actually to probe. Now I confirmed that with iron doping, iron was not forming cluster. Now, has it induced magnetization? The answer is yes. If you look at this magnetic hysteresis behavior, it shows a very good room temperature magnetic hysteresis behavior, right? It shows a finite MH loop, which is the characteristic of either ferromagnetic material or ferromagnetic material. If you look at its Curie temperature means a transition temperature from ferromagnet to paramagnet. You see that it has a Curie temperature way beyond 650 degrees centigrade. So the system revealed a magnetic hysteresis behavior. If you look at the resistivity behavior, it is showing high temperature metallic behavior. You remember I just talked about the transparent conducting oxide. So that is where this type of material is used as transparent conducting oxide. If you look at their band gap is still 3.4 electron volt. But at room temperature, they are highly conducting. How do I confirm that they are conducting or they are metallic? Just by looking into this temperature profile. If you are decreasing the temperature, the resistivity is also decreasing. This is the characteristic of metallic system. What is the characteristic of semiconducting system? If you decrease the temperature, the resistivity increases. Why? Because as you lower the thermal energy, then the chances of electron excitation from valence band to conduction band, it decreases. And therefore, your resistivity keeps on increasing with decrease in temperature for semiconductor. Or in other words, for conducting system or for metallic system, we have a positive temperature coefficient of resistance. Temperature of coefficient of resistance means 1 upon R dr by dt. So you can see here that this is positive, whereas in this particular region, when it becomes semiconducting again below say 100 Kelvin, it is negative in nature. Okay. Now, if you look at what about the spin polarized charge carrier? If you look at its spin polarized charge carrier, what does that mean? That means if I apply the magnetic field, then the resistance of the material should change, right? How do I confirm that? So we do resistivity measurement in field and without field. So if I apply a magnetic field, then the resistance change. That is nothing but the magnetoresistance. Magnetoresistance we define by resistance in presence of field minus resistance in absence of field divided by resistance in absence of field multiplied by 100. So that is our magnetoresistance. So if you look at this particular material's behavior, it shows a finite magnetoresistance behavior. So that means it has got some spin polarized carrier also in the system. Now, what is the origin of magnetization in the system? I said that iron was present in the ionic state, number one. Number two, is it really carrier mediated? That I confirmed from this magnetoresistance. Then the question arises, what was the origin of carrier in this system? Remember, in this TiO2, if you look at this particular cartoon, then I said earlier also that TiO2 does not like to be in the stoichiometric phase. It has certain tendency to form oxygen vacancy. And if there is oxygen vacancy in the system, that means it creates two free electrons available. And those two free electrons can act like a mobile charge carrier in the system. Okay, so those were the sources of charge carriers. How do I confirm that, okay, this is the only way of having charge carrier mediated magnetization, not otherwise? Then what I did, we killed this oxygen vacancy. So how do I kill that oxygen vacancy? I killed that oxygen vacancy by annealing the film in the presence of ambient oxygen. And when you anneal the film in the presence of ambient oxygen, then it it made up for the oxygen vacancy. Wherever the oxygen vacancy was there, oxygen atoms went and took its place. So it got rid of oxygen vacancy. That means those two free electrons which were available to us earlier are now no more available. So that means the system should behave like an insulator, not like this metallic behavior. And also, since I have decreased the carrier density in the system, the magnetization should also come down. Now, if you look at this particular behavior, you look at this resistivity. Now, this room temperature metal-like behavior is completely gone. Now, it is entirely semiconducting in nature. And if you look at their magnetization, the magnetization after oxygen annealing completely comes down, because we have got rid of oxygen vacancy, or in other words, the charge carriers available to us. So I will conclude my discussion for the day so that we will have some 10 minutes for discussion. That thin films offer us a plenty of opportunity to grow a wide range of materials. There are different parameters which are available with us to control those different properties. Those can be choice of the substrate, those can be oxygen partial pressure, the energy, the mode of deposition. So all these parameters are very important. Then using different techniques, particularly structural, electrical, and magnetic properties, we can grow a wide range of spintronic structures which have a different properties, a coupled electrical and magnetic properties together in the system. And I would acknowledge my colleagues and thank you all for your attention. I shall be happy to take up your queries.
Thank you very much, Ramjanay ji, for such a nice and scientific talk. Like you were talking about the thin film fabrications, the novel materials or the materials of which these thin films could be made. And everything was in quite detail done by you. After that, you also talked about the spintronic applications, spintronic devices, how they can be made, how we can play with the structures so that we are getting different type of properties in that. So thank you very much. And now the house is open for the questions. Anybody who has to ask a question, they can just raise their hand and then we can unmute you for the question. So Kashif Shamim will be asking you a question. Yes, Kashif, go on.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Sir, I just wanted to ask you one thing, sir. That if we want to deposit some ceramic on a stainless steel substrate,
okay,
using PLDO.
Okay.
So how can we, whether it is possible that we can do it?
Okay, let me put it this way. There is one term which I didn't talk about in my talk, was the sticking coefficient. There has to be a good adhesion, good bonding between the substrate and the film materials that we are trying to grow. Okay, so suppose if there is no good sticking coefficient between the substrate and the film material, then those films may not be stable. Generally, the semiconductors and the metals, they do not like to stick properly with respect to each other. Therefore, growing films on stainless steel is rather challenging. Okay, and that is why you will see that even to get a conducting substrate like, say, platinized silicon, that itself is challenging. Otherwise, what people could have done, they could have taken the silicon substrate and then on silicon they could have simply deposited platinum. But since the sticking coefficient between the semiconducting substrate and metallic system is not good, so what it actually does is that or what we generally do to get that platinized silicon is that we take silicon, then on silicon we grow silicon oxide, then on silicon oxide we grow titanium oxide, and then again on titanium oxide we grow titanium, and then on titanium we grow platinum. तो कान सीधे सीधे ना पकड़ करके उल्टे तरीके से पकड़ना पड़ता है. So to have this stainless steel and deposit with some kind of ceramics, my suggestion will be that we will have to have a proper buffer layer on the stainless steel before we can start with that ceramic deposition.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Digvijay likes to ask a question. Yes, Digvijay. Arun sir, could you please unmute Digvijay?
निशा कर दी होगी।
हाँ कर दिए।
Digvijay,
खुद को अनम्यूट कीजिए दिग्विजय।
are you there, Digvijay?
Okay, there is one question that I can read in the chat box.
Yeah, it is. I think it was posted by Digvijay himself.
Yes, the question is, what is the reason of change in resistivity in epitaxial growth? Okay, friend. See, the resistivity depends on what? Resistivity depends on your electron phonon scattering or electron scattering in the system. In your epitaxial growth film, epitaxial grown film, you have a much layer contribution from the grain boundaries because your grain density is much lesser as compared to polycrystalline film, and your grain size is larger. Therefore, your contribution due to the grain boundaries, they are completely suppressed in the system, and that causes a change in resistivity in your epitaxial film. Number one. Number two, in epitaxially grown film, if you are talking about the submonolayer or few layers of your film, then the strain is much higher. Because of that strain, the hybridization of different elements outermost orbits, they are completely changed, and because of that your valence band and conduction band difference is also changed. That also causes a change in the resistivity of the system. I hope you get the answer. Anyone else?
Yeah, there is one question that when we are preparing a film, so like you were talking about ceramics on metals.
Yeah.
In that, what will be the main factor which will be governing that the film is stuck to that, and also
Surface
the
energy.
thermal coefficient
Surface energy.
expansions are
Surface energy.
similar to each other.
Yes,
because,
yes, surface energy.
Because if you are going to heat it, naturally the thermal coefficient of expansion of metal will be different from the ceramic.
Yes.
So how are you going to control it?
We cannot control. ये तो उसका natural property है. So we just take that as a precaution, whether to use this substrate or not. As simple as that.
Oh, that's the thumb rule. Whether you can use this.
That's the thumb rule. Or otherwise, we use some kind of buffer layer.
But that buffer layer also should have a lattice matching and the thermal coefficient expansion matching with both of them.
That is true for epitaxial film growth.
Okay.
Not otherwise.
Not otherwise.
Polycrystalline film can be grown.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions from anybody? Okay, so I think there is no question for today. So Arun sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for very nice talk and elaborative talk on thin film technology. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And good luck to all of you.
Thanks a lot. So we'll meet again tomorrow.
Sure, ma'am. Yes.
And now I'll request all the participants